Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this ComSec webinar on the topic of vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. My name is Adrian Kelly. I'm the marketing manager here in ComSec, and I'm joined this morning by Joe Montgomery, who's the head of sales in ComSec, Ian O'Connell, who's our SOC team leader and a highly experienced security tester in the area of vulnerability scanning, and John Killalay, who's our technical director here in ComSec. And John is a highly experienced technical consultant, and particularly in the area of penetration testing. So if you have any questions during the session, please send them on to us on the questions tab. We'll answer them at the end of the session. We'd really like you to get as much out of today's session as possible. So absolutely, please do, and we'll have a good discussion at the end. So to kick off, I'm going to hand you over first to Joe, and Joe's going to give you some background to ComSec and the experiences we've seen in the market over the past while, really, that's brought us to the conclusion this webinar would be a useful exercise for people who want to learn more about security testing in general, but also we've seen, to be fair, people unclear about what are the differences between vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. Really, what are the actual differences between them? When do you need a vulnerability scan? When do you need a pen test, and so on? And there's a bit of confusion at times amongst people, but they're different things. Yes, there's a commonality, but they are vastly different things, their own use cases. So we're going to explore all that this morning, and hopefully by the time we're finished, you'll all be very clear about what the differences are between them and when you need one versus the other. So I'm going to hand you over to Joe now, and Joe is going to, as I said, give a little bit of background and explain some of the context that's brought us here. So Joe, in your own time there, whenever you're good to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar. I'm going to set the scene and I suppose provide some background as to why we chose this topic, penetration testing and vulnerability scanning, what you need to know. First of all, I'll just give you a quick overview. ComSec are an IT security company, IT security specialist, and we provide a number of different services, such as the penetration testing and vulnerability scanning that we'll cover today. We also provide other services such as vulnerability scanning as a service. We provide 24/7 sort of monitoring out of our security operations center, where we have SIEM and logging services there. We also provide managed multi-factor authentication as a service, cybersecurity education. We help with phishing campaigns for different companies. We also work with other technologies around IT security. And finally, we have a practice which is focusing on digital forensics, where we cover off e-discovery, digital investigations, and expert witness. But back to today's topic, I suppose the reason why we're holding this webinar today is to, I suppose, clear up. There's a certain level of confusion out there as to why organizations need penetration testing or vulnerability scanning, or in essence, why they even need both services. And what we want to cover off is that there's different types of penetration testing, whether it's authenticated penetration testing or unauthenticated tests. And then with vulnerability scanning, there is vulnerability scanning of your infrastructure, of your applications, or your wireless environments, mobile applications. And I understand that there are an awful lot of people who have a good understanding of the differences between each service, but there's many who don't. And what we're trying to do is explain the differences. As you can see in this slide here, on one side, you got the penetration testing and the vulnerability scanning. And on the penetration testing, you were sort of talking about the movie like sort of Ocean's 11, where there's a lot of reconnaissance, there's a lot of understanding of the weaknesses within an application or an infrastructure. And we're sort of, the penetration is looking for those weaknesses, whereas the vulnerability scanning is trying to identify the known vulnerabilities that are out there against a certain application or software or service. And how we sort of engage with our clients is we try to understand their requirements and their challenges, and we try to agree what needs to be done and how that is to be done. And there are a number of drivers why people need to carry out a penetration test or a vulnerability scan, or as I said, as both. And they can range from, say, for example, an organization has got cyber insurance, and to get the cyber insurance or to reduce the premiums or the cost of the cyber insurance, that they need to prove or show that they're carrying out these type of tests on their particular systems, whether it's their infrastructure or their applications. Another reason or driver is an awful lot of organizations who are dealing with third parties. The third parties need a reassurance that the companies that they're working with are carrying out appropriate security, the appropriate security tests on their systems if they're connecting into their organization, or if they're sharing information with you, that it's protected and it's being monitored, or it's not going to be available to people who are not supposed to get access to it. Also, GDPR is another driver. If organizations also want to reduce the risk of their IT security or improve the protection of their data within their organization, so it can be part of the risk management program. Companies are also sort of moving to the cloud, putting applications into the cloud, and some of those, they nearly sometimes assume that there's a high level of security there, which there is, but in certain essence, you still need to monitor and test the security of your applications that are in the cloud. And then also some organizations have got regulatory requirements, whether it's payment card or credit card requirements there. With regards to penetration testing, as I said, there are certain level of confusion out there that what is a penetration test, and we've seen with some of our clients that they've told us that they've had penetration testing, and once we've sort of reviewed the findings of the reports, that in essence that wasn't really a penetration test, it was a vulnerability scan with a certain level of manual review, and it didn't really give them what they needed. Also, we found that with vulnerability scanning, people are scanning maybe their infrastructure and think that their applications are being scanned as well. And again, that's not the case. We've also seen people who are getting proposals for, say, penetration testing, and they would have vulnerability scanning in the title or vice versa. And it's creating a high level of confusion. So basically what we want to try and do today is to explain in detail what a vulnerability scan is, how it is appropriate, and also with the penetration testing, what that means, what it can do for your organization, and the benefits of these. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Ian O'Connell. Hopefully you will enjoy this very informative session later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Again, welcome to the webinar today. So I'm going to take, my name's Ian O'Connell, and I'm the threat hunting and SOC team lead here at ComSec. So again, like Joe was saying, we here at the SOC, we manage the vulnerability scanning for our clients through CheckScan Plus and through our SOC as a service as well. So yeah, I'll take you through vulnerability scanning and what you need to know. Again, there's some great points that Joe was after mentioning as well, so I'll take you through some of them in the presentation. So I'll go through what is vulnerability scanning, why you need it, the life cycle of a vulnerability, the types of vulnerability scanning that you can do, and where it's best suited, as well as the vulnerability life cycle, how the vulnerability starts all the way down to the patch where it's remediated as well, and where to start, where to kind of build your vulnerability management program, as well as I'll talk about the vulnerability scanner versus a managed vulnerability scanning service as well, and I'll touch on a bit of vulnerability management development as well in the presentation. So I'll take you through what is vulnerability scanning. vulnerability scanning is practice of leveraging scanning tools and automation to identify known vulnerabilities on a system. So it's the use of constant schedule and continuous scanning to identify any known vulnerabilities that may be there on whether it be your infrastructure, your web applications, your external infrastructure, as well, your APIs, anything that's in your attack surface that you can and detect the known vulnerabilities. So how it differs from a pen test, there's good reasons. Both are equally important with that. So whereas vulnerability scanning will detect the known signatures, the known principles as well of a vulnerability, where a pen test is a lot more manual. It combines from the start of the cyber kill chain all the way to the end. So like Joe was saying with the Oceans 11, you have the reconnaissance of actually finding out all the bits and pieces behind an organization before you go off and go through vulnerability scanning and then deciding on exploits. Where vulnerability scanning can be done authenticated or unauthenticated as well to your assets. So with vulnerability scanning, you can continuously assess the issues that may be arising in your infrastructure or web applications. So what you need, vulnerability scanning can be required to meet standards such as PCI if you're processing credit cards, ISO 27001, and the Cyber Essentials as well. So it's there's a big emphasis on vulnerability scanning and showing to your stakeholders where you're making the improvements with your vulnerabilities, and that you're constantly remediating the vulnerabilities that may arise. So new vulnerabilities are discovered each and every day. And there's, along with that, exploits are developed in parallel. So as we've seen with the Hafnum vulnerabilities on the Microsoft Exchange servers, that was a 0-day vulnerability. So there wasn't a patch put out yet to patch those servers, which caused unauthentication logins and compromises to those Exchange servers. So yeah, vulnerability scans are used to highlight the issues detected and found. So you're able to see what vulnerability poses the most risk, where the vulnerability poses the risk as well, the impact of that vulnerability if exploited. So it gives you an idea where to go and start and where to go and patch your systems and where to put your resources as well. So I'll just take you through the life cycle of a vulnerability. It's a typical kind of window where a vulnerability could be exploited, how it starts from the development of software or a web application, whether it be a web application or third-party software or a vendor software such as like a firewall provider, Microsoft, Linux, any kind of vendor that's developing infrastructure or web applications. So what we have here is a new vulnerability is discovered. So this opens the window to exploitation. The vulnerability is then hopefully disclosed by a security researcher to that vendor, where it doesn't go out into the hands of the bad guys on the dark web, where 0 days POCs can be done and we have another Hafnum again happening. So the vendor will then try and fix the vulnerability. So they will do their internal testing and make sure that the fix works and does the job. The vendor then deploys the patch. And this is when the window starts to close. So what next happens is the patch is applied to a system or web application, and then that's the window closed. So that's where you can mitigate your risk inside this window. So the earliest that you know that the vulnerability is there, and then that you can apply a patch, is where you limit your risk on the server, web application, any kind of asset that you scan. So I'll take you through the types of vulnerability scanning that's available and why you'd probably do it as well. So there's internal versus external, authenticated versus unauthenticated, infrastructure versus web application, and all the rest, there's APIs as well. So it's pretty much anywhere that that you believe that your applications or infrastructure can be attacked is where you want to do the scanning. So maybe you might want to focus on externally. You might have a group of IP ranges, or you might have a web application. That's where you might want to focus your details, is identifying the vulnerabilities that are shown to the outside world where anybody can scan. As we know, there's hundreds of thousands attackers on the internet trying to break into everything that's there, that's viewable. So what you kind of would do it authenticated versus unauthenticated. If you're doing it unauthenticated, you're looking into from the external side again, where you're taking the black hat kind of thing, and you're going to see what vulnerabilities exist there that I can see without being authenticated. And then you might want to do a vulnerability scan if authenticated. So if an attacker has leveraged a vulnerability where that has allowed them to get access inside your system or web application, this is where they could carry out even more damage, and they could do different kind of exploits that are available there and go further, where it might cause them that ransomware attack, denial of service, defacement. They're all the different things that can be done once you're in there as an authenticated user. Again, you would do it on you do it on infrastructure or web applications or APIs, anything that you believe that the attack surface is out there as well. So I'll just move on to the vulnerability scanning lifecycle. So how we discover or how you would kick off this kind of life cycle is you would do a scan. So it starts off in the discovery. So the scanner will go off, and the scan will look for different things that's wrong. It'll detect the vulnerabilities. It then prioritizes the kind of vulnerabilities that are there. So it'll show if it's a high, medium, low, or informational. Then you might want to go and assess those kind of details that come back on a scan, and assess, okay, this asset needs to be prioritized first, or you can do the decision making in that kind of part here. Then you would do the report. So you produce a report on what needs to be fixed, so you could pass this on to maybe third parties or internally in your organization to kind of fix and remediate those vulnerabilities that exist. So next part is remediation. So this is all about applying the patches, making sure that it's fixed, and you're ready to go. And then it comes to the verification process. So this is where it comes back and links to the discovery, where you would set off a scan to make sure that you've remediated all your vulnerabilities that are not there, and that you're limiting your risk. So that's where it kicks off again. So as the scan goes, it'll discover, and then you kick off the cycle again. So prioritize, assess, report, and remediate. So it's an ongoing thing that matures over time, and helps mitigate your risk. So you're probably wondering where to start. Decide what scope needs to be addressed. So whether it's your infrastructure, your web applications, internal or external, that's where you kind of make the decision of what needs to be scanned. And then you would decide on the frequency of scans as well. So if you develop a web application, if you release a web application each month, you might want to scan on a monthly basis when the release is done, or even before the release as well in your DevOps. It's also a good frequency. It's like Microsoft release patches on second Tuesday of each month, Patch Tuesday, as we all know, and all of the vulnerabilities that are addressed there in those patches, you might want to go off and scan your internal infrastructure to make sure that those vulnerabilities are remediated by you patching as well. So you might want to then decide on a scanner tool or a fully managed vulnerability scanning service. There's a lot of pros and cons to each, so I'll discuss that later in the presentation as well. So yeah, identifying where to start. So you want to look at the assets that pose the largest danger if exploited. They can be e-commerce sites, or they could be external infrastructure, database servers. It can range. It all depends on your business. On your business. So vulnerabilities come in all shapes and sizes. As I like to say, probability and impact. Where you'll have a denial of service, remote code executions, cross-site scripting, SQL injection. These are all the kind of the heavy vulnerabilities that may exist out there. So if you come back to a business kind of standpoint and look at why you would want to address a denial of service vulnerability, it can cause an outage to your customer. So if you provide a service on a web application or through external infrastructure, and if that's exploited and a denial of service attack is done, it's complete outage for your customers. So it damages the brand. Just coming back to remote code executions, is if an attacker can leverage that and get in and perform remote code executions, they basically have system level compromise. So the likes of ransomware, malware can get in, as we've seen with Bluekeep and half of them, where ransomware, the initial vulnerability is done and proof of concept, and then later stages, ransomware and malware starts to creep in there as well. And then you come back to kind of cross-site scripting. This is more on the web application side of things, where defacement. So if a lot of attackers might do it for political reasons, or just even to gain notoriety and cause brand damage to a certain business, this is where the cross-site scripting vulnerabilities will affect that. Again, coming down to the more serious one, SQL injection, it could mean data exfiltration. So this might cause a financial impact with fines as well there, but it also again affects brand damage and customer kind of reputation. And it's why you'd want to be constantly patching and addressing these issues, the serious issues first. So I'll just move back into vulnerability scanners versus the managed vulnerability scanning service. So vulnerability scanners can be great. They're a great tool on identifying the vulnerabilities there, but require a lot of configuration and setup, and there's a lot of cost and a lot of time involved in that. So where you'd look at a managed vulnerability scanning service is there, there's less configuration there, and there's more time done on the scanning as there's more people there in that will have the knowledge and capacity to set up these really quickly and get going, so that you can stay on schedule, and you're more concerned of just getting the report and then addressing the issues that are in the report there as well. So again, it can come down to resources and skills and the knowledge of why you would want to choose a managed vulnerability scanning service over just a regular vulnerability scanner. So the resources are there, the skilled people are here in a managed vulnerability scanning service, so they can provide you the information on a specific vulnerability, whether it be internal or external web application or API. The knowledge of a vulnerability there, and the practices are there as well. So that's where we offer additional advice on remediation or kind of technical issues with a vulnerability. So if you need kind of more details on why a vulnerability is there or the context to it, that's where a managed vulnerability scanning service comes in to give you a bit more context there as well. So building a vulnerability management program is great. It's used to, again, mitigate the risk in the business. So you may start off with no scanning at all, or you might have some sort of ad hoc scanning at the moment, or once in a blue moon penetration test if you're lucky. So from there, you would probably take those reports and you would do the patching, but there wouldn't be a consistent or continuous cycle. So the next thing you need to plan is schedule the scanning. So decide when you need to do the scanning to identify the vulnerabilities, and then you would have to decide on a patching schedule as well to build up this vulnerability management program. And it becomes a rinse and repeat cycle. So your scanning becomes more mature over time, because you're able to add in more assets, you're able to give more value to the vulnerabilities and the patching, so you can actually see where you're making the improvements, or if you're not making improvements, and you're able to make business decisions there to identify, and then you can go off and mitigate your risk by patching as well. So it's a constant cycle, and it's a constant battle, because vulnerabilities are released on a kind of daily basis. So it's completely needed to get continuous scanning and scheduled scanning and get a structure in place so you're able to address these. So I'm just going to give you a more visual view of what I've covered anyway. So we have the ad hoc scanning, or no scanning at all. You would then bring that to ad hoc patching, so you can do patching now and again. But then ultimately you're building up to get scheduled scanning and scheduled patching, and then deliver continuous improvement, which will then lower your risk over time. And this is the whole point of a vulnerability management program, is to continuously reduce risk and identify any kind of weaknesses that are there. So I'll just bring you back to recap before I hand over to John to discuss kind of the penetration testing side of things. So yeah, vulnerability scanning allows you to continuously assess the issues that are ongoing on your systems, externally, internally, web applications and APIs. So new vulnerabilities are discovered each and every day, and exploits are developed in parallel. So again, you come to the vulnerability lifecycle of where to address, where you discover, you assess, you prioritize, you report, you remediate, and then you verify that the vulnerabilities have been removed, and then you kick off the scanning cycle again. You then want to kind of decide what scope that needs to be addressed. So what application, what infrastructure poses the biggest risk or the biggest danger to your organization. From there, you can address the vulnerability scanning then. So and then you might decide whether to go with a vulnerability scanner or managed vulnerability scanning service. So if you go the managed vulnerability scanning service route, there's the less time doing configurations. You're ready to go straight into the scanning and the reporting and getting that additional advice on remediations as well. And then just building up a vulnerability management program. So again, continuous scanning is needed to address the vulnerabilities on an ongoing basis, as well as bringing in patch management there to remediate them, and then continuously scan to make sure that you're safe and your risk is lowered. So yeah, if you have any other questions in the meantime, please drop them down in the box. And I'll just kind of pass you on to John Killalay, our technical director, to give his presentation on penetration testing and why you need it. So.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ian. John, just pass them on to you now. And in your own time there.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Ian. That was a lot of good information about vulnerability scanning. So good morning, everyone. I'm John Killalay. I'm the Technical Director for ComSec. I'll be following on from Ian to talk about penetration testing and the differences between it and vulnerability scanning. So first, what is a penetration test? So a penetration test is an authorized, simulated exercise of evaluating the security of a computer system. It's basically an attempt to breach some or all the security of that computer system using a range of tools and techniques. They would be the same tools and techniques that a malicious actor might use. Sometimes this is also called ethical hacking. So what is a penetration test not? It should not be seen as the way to identify all the risks that your organization might face. It is a technical assessment with a specific scope of systems. It should form part of your overall strategy to address risk in your organization. So what are the differences between a penetration test and vulnerability scan? So there are two kind of broad aspects to it. So under testing, the penetration test should be carried out manually by an experienced tester. The tester will at times use vulnerability scanning results as a starting point, but then also apply their experience to find vulnerabilities. Penetration tester understands the context of a system and looks at ways that the security controls can be circumvented. Most vulnerability scanners will conduct the same types of scans in every system. The tester may find design and complex logic flaws that an automated test may not find, such as opportunities to escalate privileges or issues with file upload features. They will attempt to exploit a vulnerability where an automated scanner may not. And they may find opportunities to chain several low-risk vulnerabilities together to become a high-risk vulnerability. And then on the follow-up to a test, the penetration test should have results that are validated for relevance to the organization with 0 false positives. Should provide clear step-by-step walkthroughs demonstrating how vulnerabilities were exploited, helping organizations with remediation. And it should provide a remediation advice that is specific to the service of being tested. So as an analogy to try and explain it further, another way to think of it is if you wanted someone to test the physical security of your building. So vulnerability scanning is like checking if the doors and windows are open, but not actually checking if you can get into the building. Whereas a penetration test, it would look for windows and doors that are unlocked, or maybe appear to be secure, but actually have a problem in how they're locked. The tester would then access the building and see how far inside they could actually get. So I created some graphics to try and demonstrate this a little bit more. So in vulnerability scanning, we have our tester who's going to kind of look at the physical security of this building. So they're going to try and check the doors, check the windows, see what they can find. And then once they're finished, they'll deliver their report kind of describing what they're able to see. But in penetration testing, they're going to kind of do some similar things. They're going to check the doors and windows, then they're also going to try and get inside and then have a route around and see what they can find. And then ultimately kind of gather some evidence of what they saw, and the report that you get will kind of demonstrate the activities of the testing. So why would I need a penetration test? First, it can help to identify and mitigate risks before a malicious actor can. It can also help with compliance to standards such as ISO 27001 or regulatory requirements in specific industries, as Joe mentioned earlier on. A customer may also require it in order for them to use your products or services. And customer-written applications can be difficult to test using automated tools alone. So what are the different types of penetration testing? Penetration tests can mean a lot of different things. It can cover any type of attempt to test the security controls of a computer system. However, we see several types that are commonly requested from customers. So first off is web application testing. This focuses on a web application that has been developed by a customer or a third party. They are usually custom made, so a vulnerability scanner may not find all the vulnerabilities present. Some web applications, such as banking or e-commerce sites, may contain sensitive information. This makes them a target for malicious actors, so they need to be tested to find any vulnerabilities present. So infrastructure testing. This can cover the infrastructure elements of an IT environment, such as servers, firewalls, network equipment, and others. Vulnerability scanning can provide good coverage of these types of devices, but a penetration test can still find other vulnerabilities and validate the findings from automated scans. Mobile application testing. So an application that has been developed for mobile devices needs to be tested too. As they are almost always custom built, they may have known vulnerabilities. It may allow unauthorized access to sensitive data or unsecured communications, so it is important for it to be tested. So what are the approaches to testing? So penetration testing can be categorized based on the amount of information and access given to the testers about the system. Different amounts of information and access can be provided for different testing requirements. One way that is used to categorize them is black box, gray box, and white box testing. I'll explain briefly what these are. So in the black box testing, the tester is given no information of and no access to the system. This most closely represents what a malicious actor would have. In a gray box test, the tester would have some information about the system and some access would be given by the administrators. This is a good balance between the use of time and testing of controls. And in white box testing, involves the tester having full access to the application, documentation of systems, and perhaps even test reports and list of current known vulnerabilities in the system. This allows for a thorough review of the entire system. So which one should I use? There are advantages to each one, and this should be considered when planning a penetration test. It should be discussed with the company supplying the penetration testing service on which is the best option to go for. I will go through three of the specific elements of these approaches in the next slides. So first is authenticated versus unauthenticated testing, which again, Joe mentioned earlier. So some systems require authentication for users to access it. This is usually in the form of a username and password, but could also include multi-factor authentication. When testing these systems, credentials can be provided to the tester, but there are pros and cons to doing this. Authenticated testing, where credentials are provided, the tester can test the full functionality of the system. This can include things like checking for users being able to access other users' information or escalating their privileges to administrator level. It can also allow the tester to focus on the system rather than spending time trying to bypass authentication, which reduces the amount of time needed to test it. This would usually be part of white box or gray box testing. In unauthenticated testing, where credentials are not provided, it can give a more accurate assessment of what a malicious actor could do. Without credentials, a malicious actor will have to try and bypass the authentication. However, they may gain access to credentials by other means, such as passwords leaked from a data breach or by conducting phishing attacks. Unauthenticated testing will more closely reflect that. This would usually be done as part of black box testing. So the second element of this is whitelisting. So some systems, especially external facing, may have a whitelist in place, such as IP addresses of known devices that are allowed to access it. Only connections to that list will be allowed. This makes it more difficult to test as the tester will not be on the whitelist. In some situations, the organization may want the tester to try and bypass the whitelist control. This will more closely reflect what a malicious actor would be able to do. However, this can be time consuming, so the organization may decide to add the tester to the whitelist. This will then allow for more time to be spent on testing the actual system. The third element is the disabling of security controls. So similar to whitelisting, there may be other controls in place that will hinder a penetration test. These can include intrusion prevention systems, host-based firewalls, web application firewalls, and others. So a similar decision needs to be made about allowing the tester to bypass these controls. So which approach is best? In all of these situations, it is worth considering that a malicious actor will have a lot more time to spend attacking your systems. They can spend months or even years looking for vulnerabilities in your IT environment, whereas the penetration tester will only have a limited number of days, so you need to try and make the best use of that time. This may lead to allowing them to bypass some of your controls. So in ComSec, we have a structured process for delivering a penetration test to a customer. So I'm just going to step through this briefly to explain to you. So once we receive the initial request from the customer, we arrange a scoping call to agree the scope of the testing. Then draft a proposal that describes what we will test. When the customer confirms acceptance, we agree a timeline and allocate resources. We then conduct the testing activities. A report is then drafted and sent to the customer, and when the customer receives and confirms acceptance, the project is closed. However, we are always available for the project, after the project, to help with the customer with any queries. By having a structured process like this, it makes sure we deliver a consistent service to our customers. So scoping a penetration test. So in order to prepare for a penetration test, the scope must be decided and agreed with the customer. This is an important step in the process, as the number of days and the skill sets of the testers will be allocated based on the scope. Getting the scope right is key to getting maximum value from the exercise. So some of the items to include in the scope would be the types of systems, the number of each type of system, the locations to be tested, the type of information stored in systems, whether it's a black box, gray box, or white box test. Are the systems accessible from the internet? A description of the services or applications, and the complexity of the applications. This should be discussed with the customer and documented so it can be referenced throughout the testing. So the penetration test report is another important part of the process. The results of the penetration test are communicated through the report and also a presentation if required. For most people in their organization, the report will be the only part of the process that they will see, so producing a quality report is crucial. There is no set format to use for a report, but there are some important elements that every report should include. So as a minimum, each report should have an executive or management summary. This provides a high-level view of the findings into senior management and non-technical people. It should be concise and clear and explain the risks the organization has. As well as that, when describing the findings, each one should have a detailed description. The reader should fully understand the finding from the description. It should have a risk rating. This allows the customer to prioritize remediation for higher risk findings. The impact of each finding should be included, so the customer understands what can happen if it isn't remediated. And remediation advice should be provided to help the customer fix the issues. So one thing we get asked sometimes from customers is, what are potential risks from testing? What will the impact be on my environment from penetration testing? Unless specifically required, disruptive testing such as denial of service should not usually be in scope. Some parts of the process may have a minor impact, such as fuzzing. This is where scripts are used to try different types and sizes of information requests. There are several steps you can take to minimize the disruption to your systems. If a test or development environment is available that closely replicates the production environment, it can be used for testing. A specific time frame can be agreed so the customer knows when the testing will happen. And testing can be done outside of business hours if required, so any extra resource usage on the systems won't impact the users. So in summary, penetration testing and vulnerability scanning are both important parts of a security function. Each has its own benefits, and ideally organizations should be doing both of them. So that's all from me. That was some information about penetration testing and vulnerability scanning. Thanks for listening. Hope you find it useful. I'll now hand back over to Adrian.
Yeah. Thanks very much, John. That was great. Okay, everybody, thanks very much. We have a few questions to work through, and I just reiterate, if any of you have any questions, please send them on to us now using the Ask Question function there. A couple of quick questions really for the panel. If you'd like to just unmute yourselves there, guys. We have a number of them. Simple enough. The first one being really in terms of how often should typically we be looking to get a pen test done? I mean, simple enough, but how often really should you be looking to get a pen test done, ideally? John, do you want to handle that?
Yeah, sure. I suppose there are some requirements around doing it at least annually from some kind of standards. So I guess most people kind of follow that. If you have like a high risk system or maybe a system that changes a lot, you might want to do it more frequently than that. But once a year is usually a good starting point.
Okay, same question coming through on vulnerability scanning then. If I'm doing a pen test, do I need to do vulnerability scans?
I'll answer that one as well, Adrian. So
yeah.
Ideally, you'd be doing both because they both have kind of different advantages, as we've kind of described in Stephanie. So ideally both. So it kind of depends on the risks your company is facing. But I suppose, yeah, ideally you should be doing both.
Okay, another question here with regard to how appropriate all this is for smaller businesses. Is this relevant for smaller businesses, or is it really only for larger companies?
Joe here. I think it's all dependent on the value of the data and how they're transacting with their clients. And so even if they're a small company and they're holding sensitive data, or they're working with larger companies who have got requirements, well, then they will need to get the testing done. So just because you're small, it's not to say that you don't need to get this testing to protect your information.
Okay,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I suppose people are just trying to understand how like someone has asked a question for a website. What type of testing is appropriate to get done for a normal website or a small company website?
So I guess you can do a form of penetration testing on a basic website. I guess maybe the questions around a kind of static site with not a lot of interactive content. There are still potential vulnerabilities in that kind of website. It's just that the testing might not take as long, so there mightn't be as much effort involved, but it still should be tested.
Okay. Someone's asking a question. What about applications that are now, born in the cloud, AWS environments, with regard to testing? Do they need to be tested? What kind of testing is required?
Yeah, those applications should be tested as well. Cloud environments are different from your traditional on-premise, but they definitely need to be tested. And as they're cloud-based, it means that they're publicly available. So there are still risks to that. Some companies seem to kind of think that because it's in the cloud, it's now secure, and that AWS or Azure are handling all the security. That's not the case. They only provide some security of the underlying infrastructure. The configuration and your applications are still your responsibility, so that they definitely need to be tested too.
Okay, and I suppose there's a question kind of referring, does that require the vendor's cooperation, or can we test without their knowledge or cooperation if it's in their environment?
The vendor being AWS or Microsoft?
Yeah, I think yeah, I suppose in the example of AWS, I think that's what this customer or this person is driving at. Yeah, like in a normal customer site, we're working with the customer to organize the test and discuss and agree. But in the case of if an environment's running out of AWS, can we test without the vendor's knowledge or blessing, or do we need to work with AWS to do a proper test?
No. So in the past, AWS required you to inform them when testing was going to happen, and you had to give them notice. Otherwise, they would see it as security risk. But they've kind of changed that now, so that they understand that companies want to test their environments and they're entitled to. So no, you don't need to ask their permission, or that you can test whenever you want to.
Okay. Okay. Linux environments. Any differences in Linux environments? Does any of this change?
Not at all. No, Linux servers and Linux environments are just as prone to having vulnerabilities as Windows. Some people think that they're more secure. Not necessarily. Some of it is down to the versions you're running and how they're configured and used. So Linux definitely needs to be tested as well as Windows.
Okay, and a similar question, I suppose, other legacy systems, Unix and legacy systems like that, how are they impacted? Do they need to be tested in the same manner? Are they able to be tested?
Yeah, they should be tested, and they're able to be tested. Probably require a specific skill set to be able to do it, and they may be seen as lower risk because they're typically not exposed to the internet, but also they tend to potentially hold sensitive information. Like the financial companies, their whole customer information might be in these legacy systems, so they definitely need to be tested or subjected to some form of testing. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, that's all the questions we had sent in to us, guys. Thanks very much. I think we'll wrap it at that, guys. That's 47 minutes. That's a lot there. So listen, thanks everybody for contributing this morning. Joe, Ian, and John, and everyone who attended. I hope you found it very useful. If you have other questions or queries, please send them on to us separately. If you'd like to chat to us separately, just drop us an email or give us a call. And we'll have the recording of this webinar available on our website next week to follow through on it. So again, thanks everyone for your time and participation. I hope you found that useful. Okay.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.